y'all, it's Ashley at Bookishrealm and I'm back with another video. You're gonna hear birds in the background today because, you know, it's actually not early in the morning. It's actually like mid-morning and I'm not sure why they're going so intense right now. They usually don't go this intense. It's kind of make me a little worried that they're going this intense. But that's neither here nor there. So if you hear birds in the background, not really much that I can do about it. Usually it's just like a nice kind of background feature. It makes me feel like I'm outside in nature, whatever. So, and they've actually stopped. Maybe they got the, you know, the notice that I am filming. Anyway, glad y'all are here back for another video. It's actually been a minute since I've done a sit down video. I've been doing a lot of reading sprints. You know, I talked a little bit about like what it's been like lately, dealing kind of with like my mental health and stuff. So I've been trying to make sure like I still keep a presence on the channel, but I haven't been doing as many sit down videos like in the past week or so. So it's nice to be sitting down doing another video. And today we're going to talk a little bit about DNFing. And it's something that I don't always actively talk about on my channel. I know that quite a few people have talked about it on their channels, but I don't think that I have ever actively talked about it. And I kind of want to talk about like my process of DNFing. So I know it's kind of like to DNF or not to DNF, and everybody has their different reasons or their methods for DNFing. So I thought that I would kind of give you a little bit of taste of my reasons for DNFing or maybe not DNFing, and then also go into some titles that I have DNF, you know, recently is actually kind of a stretch. These are books that I have actually like categorized as DNF on Goodreads, and I'll explain why I don't have that many books that are categorized as DNF on Goodreads, or it's like shelved as a DNF on Goodreads, because of the fact that I do DNFing a little differently. So, and they are back at it. So I think for the most part, like as a general book community, like we could all pretty much agree that, you know, life is too short to stay hung up on certain books. I think that that's a pretty general consensus amongst a lot of us. I think sometimes we get caught up in trying to finish a book or wanting to push through because we think the book has potential to get better. But I think for the most part, the book community is pretty adamant about the fact, like, we read a lot. There's a lot of books that get published every single month, not even year, every single month. And I just don't have the capacity to continue to read stuff that I know that I'm not going to like, or that I know is just not even worth finishing. So I think that we're pretty much all in accordance there. But I do think that everybody has kind of like a different process of DNFing. I know that there are some people who actively talk about their DNFs, like Bethany from Beautifully Bookish Bethany. She talks about her DNFs in her stats, and she talks about the reasons why she DNFs her book. She made a video where she talked about the books that she had DNF last year and the reasons why she DNF'd those books. I will make sure that I link that that video in the card symbol above. And I think that's really interesting because there are, you know, clear reasons why she's DNF'd a book. She talks about why she's DNF'd a book, and she looks at that in terms of like her statistical information. Me, on the other hand, I'm a little different. So I'm what you call a silent DNFer. I DNF books, but people don't know that I've actually DNF books because I don't talk about them and I don't actively mark them on Goodreads at all. So most of the time people are not even realizing that I do DNF, and I'm new to DNFing. I used to be one of those people who was like, you know, if I start a book, I have to finish it. No matter how long it takes me, I have to finish this book. I need to get through it. I have to persevere. I have to push through. I've got to finish this book. But I think that as I've gotten older, and as I've started reading more, as I've gotten further into my career as a librarian, I have like really genuinely realized at the end of the day that life really is too short and there's so many things that I want to read. And if I'm wasting all this time on books that I know that I'm not going to like, then it leaves less time for books that I potentially may end up loving. So I have become a lot better at saying, like, if I'm not really feeling a book, then I'm just like not going to finish it. What gets so fascinating for me, and how my methods are probably vary a little bit from some other people, although I know a couple people who do it the same way that I do. I think that for me, I have a tendency to read about 20% of a book before I actually mark it as currently reading on Goodreads. So throughout the year, which people don't know, throughout the year, there are books that I actually start, but you have no idea that I've actually started the books and I've DNF'd them, and you don't know because it's just not something that I actively keep track of. And that is especially true for like audiobooks. I think physical books already take me a little bit longer, so I'm not as inclined, which I think is a fascinating thing. I'm not as inclined to like DNF a physical book as I am like an audiobook. And I think because I move slower through physical books, and I'm also less inclined to DNF like a graphic novel or a comic or a manga. I may kind of hold back on probably pursuing a series if it is a series, but if it's just like, you know, a trade or whatever, I usually finish it, even if it's something that I just wasn't a huge fan of. And I probably, like, I had a couple of those that were in the reading vlog that probably should go up before this video, and it was just kind of, it's fascinating how, like, a lot of this I think has a tendency to happen with the audiobooks that I listen to. So with audiobooks, I usually like to get about 20% into the audiobook before I make the decision to actively, like, you know, mark it as currently reading on Goodreads. Sometimes it'll be 60-70% before I'm actively marking, and that's the only way that people know that I'm actually reading the book is when I mark it as currently reading on Goodreads, because other than that, most people don't know that I am, you know, actively reading a book, which I think is probably just a strange habit of mine. It's just a habit that I've noticed that I picked up. So if I get like 20% into an audiobook, like I started listening to Oprah Winfrey's her pick about the family where they had, I believe, 12 kids, and all 6 of the boys had schizophrenia. So I started listening to that when I got about 10% in, and I was like, yeah, you know, this is just not right now. Like, I just have no interest in reading this one right now. I think the premise of it sounded really interesting, but 10% in, I was pretty much like, yeah, it's a done deal. Like, so you would never know that I actually had started reading that book until now, because I'm telling you that I had chosen to read that book. So that's just kind of like my method behind how I DNF. So like I said, I'm a silent DNFer. I have gotten a lot better at picking things that I think I'm going to enjoy, or at least consider to be kind of like a solid read. I have not, in the past few years, I have not had a whole lot of books that I've rated 2 stars or 1 stars. And usually those 2 star, 1 star is a very rare thing for me. And when I do give a 1 star review, I usually rant and rave about it. But my 2 star reviews are usually books that are not as good as I expected them to be, and they're kind of disappointments. So that's usually where like my 2 star reviews come in. But I typically now have gotten kind of a better flow, but I think now in the position that I have as a librarian, where I'm reading a lot of things that maybe I normally wouldn't always pick up or wouldn't normally always gravitate to, I'm starting to find that my ratings are becoming more like 3.5 star ratings, instead of times when it's just been like consistently like 4, 4.5, 4.5, you know, 5 star readings, because I'm kind of tiptoeing outside of stuff that I would, you know, typically do. But I think that that's also a reason why I don't have this many DNFs as expected, because I've really grown into my reading taste, and I kind of can tell, like, okay, this is probably going to be for me, this is probably not going to be for me. That's not to say that there haven't been times when I've gotten into a book that I thought was going to be for me, and I'm like, yeah, this is not what I anticipated it being. A good example of that is Which is Steeped in Gold, which I feel like half of the community just did not like that book anyway. So I don't feel so alone in that. So many people that I know, that I trust, that have similar tastes to me, people who even have different tastes than me, people who read all over the place, tried Witches of Gold, and they were like, it just was such a dense book. And not because of the cultural disconnect that I think that some people may have from like her writing from a Caribbean perspective, but and not writing it in terms of like ease of access, writing it for certain types of eyes. The book itself, like the writing was just not, it was not a good book. So like, you know, I thought I was going to love that one, you know, Jamaican inspired fantasy. I was like, you know, this definitely is something that I can relate to, something that I think I'm going to love. And it was not good at all. And I DNF that one. So, you know, sometimes there are books that are kind of like a miss for me, and I think that I am going to like them. Now, some of the interesting like conversations that surround DNFing, which I want to dive into a little bit, is like, at what point do we count books that we DNF? Personally, I don't really care what people count, what they don't count, not my business. Not a reading competition. I just don't, I don't really care what your numbers are when it's all said and done. But I know that there's been some like discussion about the fact, like, at what point do you count a DNF book as a book that you've read? Is there a certain percentage that you should count that book as, you know, as a book that you've read for the year. If you've only read 20%, should it still be on your like books that you read this year, or should it not be on the list of books that you've read this year? But if you've read 50 or 60% of that book, should you count it towards your Goodreads goal? Personally, I think that that's kind of like an individual decision. I think that people are going to see it both ways. I think that people are going to have perspectives both ways. Like I said, I'm kind of like, I just don't care. I don't care at all. But what I do appreciate is when people DNF and they give, and it doesn't have to be like a 3-paragraph review or anything, but I do appreciate when people like DNF'd at 30%. Here's why. Could be 2 or 3 sentences where they're like, I DNF that book. And not everybody does that, but I do appreciate when people do stuff like that, because because then people have that question of like, should you rate a book that you DNF'd because you technically didn't finish it? And so I think that when people are giving like a breakdown of why they DNF'd the book, I don't think I mind a rating as much as when like people just like DNF 1 star, no explanation. Like, it's kind of like one of those things. And to each his own. Like, Goodreads is a very interesting platform because people can there's no gatekeeping in Goodreads, meaning that there is no type of filter to determine like who can post reviews, and you can't prove that someone's read a book or that they haven't read a book, or people rate books before books are actually released. So Goodreads is just a very interesting platform. So I always kind of go back and forth about it, but I think on a gut reaction, not saying that my reaction is right, I'm not saying that I'm right, because I could be totally wrong in my assessment of this. I just feel like my gut reaction is to feel a little bit more comfortable with those who DNF, rate the book, and then explain why they DNF'd and their rating behind it. To me, it just feels more justified. That could also be like the librarian in me, like whenever I have to go through professional reviews, and granted, people who do professional, they finish the book whether they like it or not. But I think for me, one of those things is just kind of like, I respect the fact that like you've given your thoughts and you've explained like, I didn't like this and this, and this is the point at which I was like, there's no going back, there's no return, and so here's my rating of this book. And I don't know what we should say, like should 50% be the mark at which you can count a book read as in DNF, or 50% should be the mark at which you can rate a book that you have DNF'd. It's just a very complex conversation, and one that I think is so individualized, and one that we could just essentially go down the rabbit hole with, because there are very interesting points on both sides of that argument. But I think that DNFing is it's a very interesting part of the community. I think like we openly DNF, but then the way in which we DNF is so highly contested amongst certain circles. Like, it's like, okay, yeah, we all DNF, but how you DNF is the question at hand here. Like, do you DNF where you're rating a book or you're counting it as read? And so it's a very interesting conversation. So anyway, like I said, going back, because I just got off a little bit on a tangent, going back to my original point, I am a big supporter of DNFing. I think that I have grown to appreciate DNFing more as I've gotten older. I think I've appreciated. I don't feel as inclined to finish everything in front of me. It's kind of like sitting down to a meal, and the meal is like really just not that good, but you've been taught all your life that you have to finish everything on your plate, but really you're like, life is too short and I really don't want to eat this thing. I think I'm kind of in that headspace where I'm like, life is too short, I really don't want to consume this thing, so I'm not going to consume it, because there are like millions of other things that I can be consuming at this point. So like I said, I don't actively keep track of a lot of the things that I DNF. As a matter of fact, I think that my actual list of DNFs on Goodreads is extremely short. And what's ironic about this is that there are books on my DNF shelf on Goodreads. I'm looking down at my phone to look at that shelf right now, and there are active books on my DNF shelf that I technically have not DNF'd. These are books that I have, let's put it this way, I've DNF'd them because I needed to save them for later. So a good example of this is that These Ghosts Are Family by Maisie Card. I didn't DNF that book. I haven't gone back to it, but it wasn't like a hardcore, like I'm never going to pick this book up again. It was I needed the physical book or an ebook copy of that one because I started listening to it on audio and it was very, very hard for me to follow. So I needed to do either a blended read or I just needed to do an ebook or physical read of it because it was just one of those books where just audio alone was just not going to work for me. I think that what I found very interesting when I went and I looked at my list is that there are books on here that I quote unquote DNF that I think I started but didn't know like how to remove from my bookshelf, like books that I've read before and went to go reread them and then just didn't finish my reread and then I put them on the DNF shelf. So like Fallen Kingdoms by Morgan Rhodes, I've read that book. I've given that book like 4 stars and then I have it on my DNF shelf and I'm like, well, why do I have it on my DNF shelf? It's very interesting. But there are 4 titles on here for sure that I have DNF that I'm never going back to. One being Which is Steeped in Gold, which this one actually does have a very low rating, and that's probably one of the interesting things about the books that I have DNF'd is that they all sit at below 3.5 stars. So I not that this should always be like an indicator like, oh, you know, if something's below 3.5 stars that means that people agree with no, but I just find that interesting. Like Which is Steeped in Gold, it's the one that I did not enjoy at all and it has a 3.25 rating on Goodreads, which for a YA book is actually pretty low. And a lot of people just did not enjoy that one. I also did DNF A Sweet Mess by JC Lee. I wanted to like this one and I was 50% through that book and I was so bored. It was boring. And I think that that's kind of when I came to terms with the fact that I do not typically do very well with, you know, romance that is traditionally published. Not that I don't read it, not that there hasn't been any that I've enjoyed, but a lot of them for me at this point in my life are kind of like middle of the road. And that's because I think that to some degree, a lot of them end up being formulaic. This is just my opinion. You know, there are people who love traditionally published and there are some really, really good ones out there. But I just know for me personally, I've been skewing more to indie in the past year or so because of the fact that I just have not been enjoying traditionally published romance. So A Sweet Mess was one of those traditionally published. I really wanted to try something by JC Lee, 50% in the book. I really did not enjoy what I was reading. So I ended up DNFing that one. Another one is We Were Restless Things by Cole Nagamatsu, and this was done in 2020, and what I thought was really interesting about this is that I actually made the point that I typically don't DNF, and this was an arc that I had been given, and I made it 40% through and realized that the book just was not what it was being marketed as, and it just didn't work for me. I think that this is another YA book that actually has a pretty low rating, sitting at a 3.24. And the book just was not marketed. It was not marketed fairly, I don't think. I think readers went into it thinking they were going to get one thing and actually ended up getting something completely different. And it's just one that I really did not enjoy that one either. And then the last one that I DNF was Minion by L.A. Banks. This is when we were doing a book club of some sorts, like in 2020. And, you know, Minion was our pick. And I just couldn't get with the writing of Minion. I know that people love the Vampire Huntress series. You know, L.A. Banks is very revered writer. People really enjoy her, but I just couldn't do it. It just wasn't one that I thought was great. So, you know, that's one that I did end up DNFing. So those are 4 books that I actually did DNF. Other ones that I just DNF, like I don't remember that I DNF'd them because, like I said, I don't document. And I don't know whether like this will be something that I will eventually do in the future, if this is something that I will actually, you know, keep track of in the future. It's just something that I'm not necessarily interested in keeping track of, to be quite honest with you. I think that my silent DNFing is something that I do prefer to do. It is something that I do enjoy, and you know, I just don't have the capacity to really keep track of this stuff. But I do think it's interesting when people do. But that's just my style DNFing. I wasn't sure like if people actually knew that like I do DNF because I know in the past I've said like, yeah, I don't DNF, it's kind of hard for me to DNF, but like I have realized like over the past year or so that I do. It's just in a different method than other people DNF. So, you know, to all of my silent DNFers out there, I hear you, I see see you. We usually don't say anything. We just remove the book silently from our Goodreads. It's in currently reading and all of a sudden it disappears. I have one like that actually right now. I'm listening to Pilar Ramirez, and I am not doing too well with that one. I actually had it on audio. I think the audiobook has returned, but I think that maybe format wise, the audiobook just wasn't good. I wasn't enjoying it, and I almost don't want to give up on the book just yet because the audiobook wasn't good. So maybe if I try a physical read of it, it will be different. I don't know if that's going to be true or not, because it generally seems to be getting okay reviews, which is how I was feeling about the book, which is kind of okay. And I had gotten about 20% into it. So this is where I get kind of like awkward with that tiptoeing. Like, I don't know. Am I going to remove it from my shelf or am I going to leave it on my shelf? And you will never know. Like, if I never talk about it, you'll never know whether I started the book, finished. Like, you'll never know what happened in between the time that I actually did start that book and the time that, you know, you may never hear about the book again. So I do that. Sometimes you'll see me currently reading something on Goodreads. Like, let's say I make it to the 20% mark and I'm like, okay, this is all right. I think I can keep going. I mark it as currently reading on Goodreads, and then all of a sudden you never see the book again. It's because I silently DNF'd it. So I see all my silent DNFers out there. I'm with you. I feel you. All right, y'all, in the comment box below, let me know, like, what are some books that you have DNF'd? Like, do you DNF? What are your thoughts behind DNFing? I'm really interested in hearing people's thoughts about, like, people who rate books that they DNF, and then, like, people who count books that they DNF towards their reading goal. Like, that, I think that seems to be kind of a, you know, a conversation that we've had. I don't know if that's been like a booktube conversation that's happened lately, but I can't remember if it's happened lately. But I definitely think it's interesting to get some perspectives on that. As always, if you like this video, make sure to give it a thumbs up. If you want to see more content from me, click the subscribe button, hit the bell for notification, and I'll be back with another video soon. Doodles.